I'm Ariel, and I will be talking about the Electoral College voting system in the United States. So when the United States first became an independent democracy, there was a lot of debate and conflict on how to elect their first president. There was concern about using the direct democracy, which is when individuals directly elect and vote for the president, because people believed that the general public didn't have enough education or knowledge to make a educated decision on that. Another issue was that smaller states were afraid that larger states would have too much of a say because of their population and would over-dominate the votes. This was further exemplified because the 3/5 compromise had just been ratified, which allowed southern states to count 3/5 of the enslaved population in their total census, which would then contribute to their voting power, even though slaves at the time were not able to vote. And so the Electoral College system kind of came up as this compromise in order to unite the states under the federal government, while still giving the states sovereignty and allowing them to have power to elect their president. And so how does this system work? Every state gets a certain number of electoral votes, and they're divided amongst 1 for the House of Representatives and 2 for each of the senators. So the minimum number of electoral votes a state can have is 3, and then the votes continue to go up according to their population. There are some issues with this, however, one of them being it gives disproportionate amount of power. So the House of Representatives is supposed to represent roughly around 760,000 people, and that is what the electoral votes are based off of. But if you look at an example between Wyoming and California, for example, and you break it down for the population per electoral vote, what happens if states have populations that are less than the 760,000. We can see here that the number of people per electoral vote in California is nearly 730,000 compared to 192,000 in Wyoming. This essentially means that Wyoming has 3.8 times as much voting power as people in California. And you can see how that makes a big difference across states. If you want to see that visually, you can see here that those states that are larger represent the more voting power that they're given. And you can see the general trend is that smaller states have a larger voting power compared to the larger states with larger population. And this shows how the Electoral College is not necessarily very proportional across the United States and not very representative of what the individual people may want. Another way we can look at this is through geography. If we take a look at the 2020 election between Biden and Trump, we can see clearly here that Biden won with electoral votes. But if we imagine we take a few of the swing states and look at them a little bit more closely. If we have 5,000 Republicans and 5,000 Democrats switch places between California and Arizona, then between Minnesota and Wisconsin, 10,000 individuals switch places. And likewise, between Alabama and Georgia, we see overall that 41,000 people have moved. No state populations have changed, and no individual person's political opinion has changed either. But now if you were to count the votes with just the 41,000 people that have changed, Trump would win Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. And overall, the election would have been a tie in 2020. This just goes to say how these 41,000 people essentially dictate this scenario an election and have that disproportionate amount of power within an election. So that leads us to say, is it possible to win in terms of having the vote numbers and the popular vote, but having the minority of electoral votes? And the answer is yes. This has actually happened 5 times over the course of the history twice, most notably in the 21st century with Al Gore, which had been mentioned in Winnie's presentation, I believe, and most notably the recent one in 2016. We see here that Clinton won the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, which is a lot. But because of the way that the votes were spread across the country, it didn't count for the electoral votes. And Donald Trump ended up winning the electoral votes and ended up winning the overall election. The problem with this system is that it's a winner-take-all system. And so even if you have a few hundred votes more in a state for one party, all of the electoral college votes will go towards that one party. So that leads us to the question of just how few votes would a candidate need to win these 270 electoral votes. We can look at these in two different ways, one looking at large states and one looking at small states. So if we make the assumption that there are only two candidates in this situation, and one candidate wins with by just one vote over the halfway point, and no other states vote for them, which is a very unrealistic situation, but it kind of just goes to show the extremity of this. Then, if we look at large states, a candidate only needs to win 11 states in order to get over the 270 threshold. Out of 50 states, 11 of the largest states would give it enough electoral votes to win. And by doing this, in this situation, the presidential candidate would win with only 27% of the popular vote. Additionally, you can do it the same way with smaller states, going with states with the fewest electoral college votes and adding them all up that way. And if you ran through that process, you would get only 23.1% of the popular votes would be needed in order for this presidential candidate to be elected into office. So it just shows the skewedness of the system. In like the most extreme case it could be, you could end up winning with a very, very small percentage. So there are a lot of issues that we've talked about, but what are ways that we can address them? The most obvious one would be to abolish it and to use the popular vote. But this is very difficult because unlike all of the other issues we've talked about tonight, the electoral college system is directly written in the Constitution, and so this makes it very, very difficult to change and would require a constitutional amendment with 2/3 of the House and Senate and 3/4 of the states ratifying it. To put that into perspective, I believe only one constitutional amendment has been repealed over the course of history, and that was prohibition. So it would be very difficult to go through and change it. So something else you could do would be to use the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is essentially a similar thing, but goes around the technicality of the Constitution. And this would be to award all electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. And this would require all states to come together and decide to give all of their electoral votes to whoever won the popular one. Another way would be to apportion electoral votes according to the percentage of popular vote. And so, for example, if a candidate won 60% of the popular vote, they would end up getting 60% of the electoral votes. And lastly, something you could do would be to assign electoral votes at district levels. This is something that's currently done in Maine and Nebraska already, but it would divide up the electoral votes within a state into district-wide elections so that it is less of a winner-takes-all situation and the electoral votes are more proportionally assigned to the districts. So in conclusion, the Electoral College system was come up with essentially when the US was starting, and it was good for that time being because of all of their differences. And it created good sovereignty between the states and the federal government. But as our democracy evolves, it's important to also question whether this electoral college system remains the best mechanism for electing our president, or if there are any better alternatives that would better reflect our society and the equity that we are looking for. And so whether we pursue to reform things or to abolish things, I think it's good to keep in mind a goal that we should ensure that every vote carries the same weight and that the outcomes of our election generally affect the will of the people. Thank you.
Great presentation. So on that last slide, when you talked about possible solutions for this kind of imbalance in representation, when you get to the one about assigning electoral votes at the district level, would you also run into gerrymandering there? And then which out of these that you present do you think is kind of the best alternative for us to use?
That's a good question. Yes, if you're going to go to district level, you are going to run into the fact that in order to create these districts, you have to draw the lines, and those are not always representative of the people, as we've learned about. All of these come with their challenges. I think personally that assigning the percentage vote for the popular vote and the electoral vote might be the easiest to get around because it wouldn't require getting every single state to come to agreement to do something, which I think is a little bit challenging.
Thanks, Sarah.